Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sally Whipple. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House, and we are so happy to have you here at the Old State House, whether you're here in person or watching this live streamed or as a recording. We're here today for a program called Turning the Tides of Justice. It's a remembrance of the African men and children who fought for their freedom on the high seas near Cuba, and again in courtrooms from Hartford to New Haven to Washington, D.C. 182 years ago today, the Amistad trial started here in this room where you are now seated. This is the day the trial started.
Singbe, Grabo, Kimbo, Nashaulu, Berna, Gbatu, Gnakwoi, Kwong, Fuliwa, Pie, Punguni, Sesi, Modu, Ndamma, Fuliwulu, Bao, Ba, Shule, Kale, Bagna, Sa, Kina, Gahoni, Fang, Fagina, Vaboy, Fabana, Sukama, Betty, Fani, Shuma, Kali, Teme, Hagne, Margut.
Those are the names of some of the men and children we remember and honor today and every day. They came from Africa, and many returned to Africa. They started their journey alone, but members of Hartford's Talcott Street Church supported them in their return home to Africa. Today, Talcott Street Church lives on as Faith Congregational Church, and Faith is supporting us today, just as they supported the Amistad Africans. Our program today begins with Wayne Dixon, Minister of Music at Faith Congregational Church, and soloist Patricia Gray, performing Lift Every Voice and Sing, followed by Steal Away, performed by Voices of Hartford, a group of young men who raise their voices in order to help us lift ours. And I'd like to ask you to please rise for our first performance.
Make them hear, make them hear, and tell them in our struggle we're not the only ones. Make them hear you, make them hear, and say to those who blame us for the way we chose to fight, that sometimes there are battles that are more than black and white, and I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Go out and tell our story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Now justice was our battle, and now justice was denied. Make them hear you, make them hear you. Your sword can be a sermon for the power of the hand. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, and will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. Make them hear you. When they hear you, I'll be near you
Thank you so much to Patricia Gray and Wayne Dixon from Faith Congregational Church, and also to, Miles?
Yes.
Wilson Tolliver. I think that hearing this music today is just so important to the Amistad story, because music communicates so many things so beautifully. And one of the issues in the Amistad case was communication. People didn't speak the same language, and they were trying to solve various problems. The Amistad case is incredibly complicated, and you really run up against that when you try to give a tour to people who don't know anything about it at a historic site. And you have to be very, very particular and careful in the words you use, or you may leave a wrong impression with people. So we have really been studying the Amistad story, trying to overcome some of the myths that surround it, to overcome some of the misinformation, and to read things very carefully. Our whole staff has been doing that. And the hard thing is when we get together to compare notes about what we've learned, we come up with many more questions than we had when we first started. But one person who has really taken the lead on studying the Amistad story this year is Mariana Garcia. And she is the person who read the names of the Amistad Africans at the beginning of this program. And now she's going to lay out the story of the Amistad for us so that we can keep it in our minds and our hearts. And I would like you to join me in welcoming Mariana to share this story.
Thank you, Sally. And thank you, everybody, so much for being here today for the anniversary of the start of the Amistad trials and the Mendes legal battle for their freedom. On the hours before dawn of July the 2nd, 1839, the deck of the Spanish schooner La Amistad became a site of rebellion. Down in the cargo hold, 53 captive Africans managed to slip the chains binding their hands and feet together. Then they gathered around, as they would when preparing for war, and quietly planned their next move. For them, this was just the latest stretch on a months-long horrific journey. Their saga started in Mendiland in Western Africa, where they had been kidnapped and forced aboard a slave ship across the Atlantic to Spanish-ruled Cuba. All through their voyage, they were brutalized, bound, dehumanized, and finally sold like livestock in the markets in Havana. Their purchasers, two Spaniards called José Ruiz and Pedro Montes, chartered a small ship called La Amistad to take them and their cargo to the other side of the island. But just days into their journey, the Africans were readying themselves to fight back. By sunrise, they had taken control of the ship, killing the captain and other members of the crew, but sparing Ruiz and Montes, with the intention of forcing their would-be enslavers to sail them back to Africa. Months later, and thousands of miles away, Connecticut's Old State House came to be part of this epic saga, when the Amistad Africans found themselves having to continue their fight for freedom, this time from within the United States legal court system. The Amistad case has become canonical in the history of abolition here in the United States, and it's certainly one of the most famous stories in Connecticut, and one of the cornerstone stories here in the Old State House. But in speaking with our visitors about it, we've come to learn that many of them are surprised by some of the aspects of this story. So before we continue, I just really wanted to point out a few facts that some of you may already know, some of them might surprise you. The first is that slavery was legal here in Connecticut when the Amistad trial was taking place in 1839. And it had existed since colonial times, and it would not be abolished until 9 years after the Amistad trials in 1848. The second is that even though many states still allowed slavery, the federal government had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade many years before in 1808. This meant that it was illegal to bring people from Africa across the Atlantic to be sold into slavery here in the United States. For anyone to be considered legally enslaved and be legally sold and purchased, they had to have been born here in the United States. Great Britain, and most importantly for this story, Spain, had also passed similar laws abolishing the slave trade. But of course, many illicit slave ships still made the journey, including the one that brought the Amistad Africans to Cuba. And finally, the third point I wanted to bring out was to mention that the Amistad Africans were never really tried as criminals, and that the trials were not really about their mutiny on board the ship and the murder of the Amistad's crew. The federal courts determined very early on that they did not have jurisdiction to try the Africans for these charges. The issue at the heart of the case was actually much more sinister than this. Before the start of the trial here in Hartford, The US Navy captured La Amistad on Long Island Sound almost 2 months after their successful uprising near Cuba. They had drifted northwards, zigzagging up the eastern coast, and finally anchored in Montauk Point in New York to gather fresh water. That's where they were seized by the US Navy brig, the USS Washington. And this is also the moment when one of the key elements to understanding the Amistad trial comes into focus. Because according to maritime law, if a ship rescued another ship that was in peril out at sea, the rescuers were entitled to a percentage of the value of that ship and its cargo as a reward for having rescued the ship. This is called salvage. And the crew of the Washington, knew this when they rescued, quote unquote, rescued the Amistad. And they also knew that if the Africans were considered legally enslaved and property and counted as part of the ship's cargo, this would add to the value of the reward that they would receive. So this would be the issue at the heart of the case, whether the Amistad Africans were free human beings or merely merchandise. So the Washington towed the Amistad to New London Harbor, and the commanding officer of the ship, Lieutenant Thomas Getney, he immediately summoned a district court judge to come evaluate the case so they could immediately file their salvage claim. The judge who came aboard was a man called Andrew Judson. For some context on Judson, he was also the main instigator behind the creation of the Black Law that made Prudence Crandall's school for Black girls illegal just a few years before that in 1833. Judson convened a special session on board the ships and heard testimony from everyone involved except for the Africans, because no one could understand their language. They were unable to tell their side of the story. So Getney wanted salvage, but of course the Spaniards, Ruiz and Montes, they were demanding that their property be returned to them. They claimed that the Africans had been legally purchased in Cuba, and they had been Cuban born, and they even produced fraudulent documents in order to back up their story. So with so many competing claims, Judson ordered the Africans to be kept in custody in the New Haven jail until their legal property status could be verified. And the US attorney also filed charges for piracy and murder against the Africans. But Judson referred these charges to the US Circuit Court, where they would be very quickly, almost immediately dropped because of a lack of jurisdiction. But while waiting in jail for their day in court, the Africans collected many allies. A group of local abolitionists created the Amistad Committee to help them build their defense and fund their legal fees. Some of these allies spent hours with the Africans in jail trying to bridge the language barrier and to understand their story, till they finally found a translator, a man called John Ferry, who could speak a little bit of one of the many languages that the Africans spoke. So weeks later, most of the Africans came to Hartford for the first court hearings, and they were jailed in Pearl Street Prison, which would have been just down the street from here. And the trial began right here in this room on September 17th, 182 years ago today. The first part of the case fell to the Federal Circuit Court, with Justice Thompson of the US Supreme Court presiding. The Africans' lawyers filed a habeas corpus for the children that were on board the Amistad, demanding their immediate release. They told the court that the children had been born free in Africa and never legally enslaved, thus invalidating their detention. 3 little girls were brought to this courtroom, and one of the Amistad men, called Bao, he testified in their behalf. But the judge denied the girls' release because they were still part of the property dispute between the Spaniards and the crew of the Washington. Following this, the court considered the criminal charges of piracy and murder and ruled that the US did not in fact have jurisdiction to try them for these charges because they were events that took place out in the high seas on board a Spanish vessel. So those charges were dropped, leaving only the property dispute for the court and the question of whether the Africans were free people or just cargo. So let's recap, because I'm sure there's a lot of moving parts in this case. So Lieutenant Getney and his crew from the USS Washington were demanding salvage reward for having rescued the ship. And according to maritime law, this reward would come from the value of the ship's cargo. And in order to determine how much reward Getney and his crew were going to get, the court had to decide whether the Africans were considered legally enslaved or legal property and would be counted as part of the cargo. Meanwhile, the Spaniards, Ruiz and Montes, were demanding their property be returned to them, still claiming that they had purchased the Africans legally in Cuba. The Spanish ambassador had also involved himself in the case on behalf of his countrymen and was putting pressure on the US government to return all Spanish property from on board the Amistad without deducting any value for the salvage reward. And finally, the Africans, of course, were calling for their own release, insisting that they had been born free in Africa and had been illegally kidnapped and enslaved. All of these claims were heard right here in the Old State House by Judge Andrew Judson, part of the US District Court. So the court adjourned on September 23rd and reconvened on November 19th, again here in Hartford in the Old State House. All the Africans were taken back to New Haven, and only a handful of them returned to Hartford for the continuation of the trial. But something important happened in the time in between the two sessions, and that is the discovery of one James Covey, a young sailor from West Africa who was fluent in the Mende language. And for the first time, the Africans finally had the ability to fully testify in their own defense and tell their whole story. So Covey was recruited as their translator. So the second session, according to the newspapers, started upstairs in the Senate chamber. With Covey translating, the Africans brought a plea challenging everybody's property claim over them. The lawyers demanded that the whole case be dismissed over a lack of, because the Africans had been born free. And unfortunately, further testimony had to be postponed because James Covey fell ill. If it had not been for that, perhaps the entirety of the Amistad trials would have taken place here in Hartford. But instead, the remainder of the hearings will be heard down in New Haven the following year, starting January 7th of 1840, after Covey had recovered. So you probably know the rest of the story. Many of the Africans continued to argue their court case in New Haven, while the case garnered immense public interest all over the country and beyond. After hearing testimony after testimony, Judge Judson finally ruled that the Africans were in fact natives of Mendeland, not Cuban-born, and that they had been kidnapped and sold against both Spanish and United States law. Therefore, they would not be considered part of the ship's cargo or counted as part of the salvage reward for Getney and his crew. Instead, they had to be released and returned to Africa. But this ruling was famously appealed by the US government, in part because President Martin Van Buren wanted to maintain good diplomatic relations with the Spanish crown. So after a short appeals hearing in the Federal Circuit Court, again here in Hartford, the case moved up to the United States Supreme Court down in Washington, D.C. This is when former President John Quincy Adams joins the Amistad's defense team. And it's also when the Amistad Africans claimed their final victory in court in March 9th of 1841. And the entire court case lasted almost 1 year and a half. After this, the Amistad Africans regrouped with their allies, including members of the Talcott Street Church in Hartford, to find a way to return back home with their hard-won freedom. But this ending is bittersweet. Because of the original 53 men and children that were on board the Amistad, only 35 survived long enough to make the journey back home. And while many of them did reunite with their families, some were tragically never able to find their loved ones again. But the story continues to inspire us and urge us to reflect on the length that the human spirit can go in its fight for freedom. So that was a very brief overview of the Amistad case. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mariana. That is a lot of work to boil that story down, but she really hits all of the important marks on it. And one thing that we realize as we look at the Amistad case is that there are many ways to learn about history and many ways to begin understanding how it impacts our lives today. You can look at images from the past. You can read primary documents. You can read what other historians have done. You can also have an experience like the one you are about to have with a woman named Tammy Denease, who is a good friend of ours. She is a performing artist, a storyteller, an actor, and a playwright. And she specializes in breathing life into the stories of important women who have been hidden from history. We are so lucky that Tammy has chosen as one of the women she portrays, Margot, a child of the Amistad. And today, she is really going to help us better imagine and understand the experience that Margot would have had in the courtroom. You can also go down to the ship, which is docked down at the riverfront, and think about the experience Margot would have had on that ship, La Amistad. But today, we're really going to focus on the courtroom. And so I'd like to introduce Tammy Denease.
My name is Sarah Mabu, but before I was Sarah, I was Mabu. I come from a place that is warm and tranquil, a place that is loving. But I tell you, that place will soon disappear. I come from a family of farmers. We were rice farmers, and life was not always easy, but it was a place of love. We laughed, we spent time together. But then the most powerful wind, the Harmattan, would come through and it would destroy my father's crops, and we would have to take advantage of the farming system. But I did not mind, for it meant that I would be gone only for a short period of time. Or so I thought. The one that I was bound to, he decided that he did not wish to wait for payment, and he sold me to what I thought was a legend. You see, our parents would often tell us about the pale-faced Libby's ghost that would take us away, but we thought it was just a legend, a tall tale, if you will, to keep us close to home. But I tell you, it is a nightmare in the daytime. They would capture many of us from our village and surrounding areas, and they would march us to the shore for many, many days. And we would get to the big river, and there was a large vessel that I had never seen before. I was fascinated with this flapping cloth, but soon I was terrified. For you see, they would take us and they would shove us into darkness. And below there was a stench and a foul smell that made us ill. And there were many that looked like me, but they were not me. They could not speak the same tongue. There were many chained to this side, many chained to this side, and there were many in the middle that lay upon each other. And where you lay is where you believed yourself. There were cats and rats, and there were those who screamed out in hysterics for fear of not knowing where we were going. And although we could not speak the same tongue, we knew that we were headed for an uncertain destiny, one that we could not fare well in. And after a few days of being aboard this large vessel, we were transferred to a smaller vessel called La Amistad. Oddly, that name means friendship, but I tell you, the treatment we received was less than friendly. They would torture us, they would treat us so cruelly, and they would make the mistake of doing this to one of the elders. And that is when Elder Singbe knew that something had to be done. And so, as blacksmiths in the village, they knew how to work the chains, and they would break a loose, and they would take this vessel, and they would force the captains to take us back in the direction of the sun, for that is the way from which we come. But at night, they would deceive us and take us in a different direction. And for many, many moons, we would go up and down this big river until finally someone would come, and they would take us, and they would bring us into a place called London, Connecticut. I would later find out that if they had taken us to a place called New York, that we could have been free. But because of these salvaging rights, they would bring us there. The jailer would take all of us and put us into his cell, and he would offer out, people would pay him money to come and see us. They would gawk at us as if we were animals. And the jailer, he made lots of money. He would take us 3 girls, myself, Kanye, and Kine, and we would have to go to his house to be workers. They did not treat us well. We missed the elders, and soon we were told that there would be a trial, that they had to decide if we were going to be free. I did not understand them, Tony. I was very much afraid. So one day, we were brought to this very window, here where I stand. I remember that day so well. I was afraid. I remember shaking, and I remember crying. I was so afraid I did not know what would happen to us. But then a calm came over me when I looked and I saw the elder. I saw Elder Singbe and he gave me a look that made me feel safe. I did not know how we would be safe, but he made me feel safe. He reassured me with that one look. I did not understand what they were saying. I just wanted to go home. And soon it was over and we were taken back to the jailer's home. But then we were brought back a little while later. And this time, when I walked into this room, I could speak their language. I could understand what they were saying. And they were saying that we were not people. They talked about us as if we were property, that we belong to them. This is not true. We were coming from our home and they snatched us from what was most familiar to us, our home, our families, and they wanted to make us their property. Soon as time would go on, I would meet Mr. Talcott. He brought me the next time to that trial, and again I was upset and I cried. He offered me an apple and he told me that I would be okay. I felt a little calm, but I felt even calmer when I saw the elders again. Again, I would get that look that we would be okay. Now, we were going to be taken into Farmington, but as that trial was going on, the fear that I felt, I just wanted to go home. I had never felt so, how do you say, unsafe and vulnerable. There were nothing but pale-faced witness ghosts around me, and all I could think of was how I really wished that they were that I was back home with my family, but instead I was surrounded by them. I did not know how I would be. Again, I would look to the elders for security and safety, and they would give me that. But I was so uncertain, for they were shackled. They were like animals. Why do they treat them this way? They are elders in our village. They are people. I did not understand. Why did they wish to keep us here? We just want to go home. But then we would be taken into the place called Farmington. And there, they treated us better, but not so much so. They did not welcome us the way they made the public think that we were welcomed. And soon we would be free of sorts, but we could not go back home because we did not have the money. And soon, those in the area, the abolitionists, and they would take us on what is called a, how do you say, a speaking tour, where we would go and we would speak of our adventure aboard Amistad. Adventure. We would talk about what happened here in this very room. We would talk about the treatment we would receive aboard both vessels, and we would talk about our own lives. We would sing and we would dance, but all we wanted was to go home. And I tell you, each time we told the story of how we felt in this courtroom, it made me feel empty inside. It made me feel scared. It made me feel out of sorts. I miss my family. I just wanted to go home. But as I stand here today and I tell you the story, it is not one that I take lightly. It is one that would change our lives forever. It was a 2-year adventure for us, but our lives would never be the same. But throughout my life, I would remember what life was like in this very room. I remember being a little girl who sat on a bench whose feet could not touch the floor. I remember sitting there wishing that my father was coming to get me. And then I remember sitting and looking at the elders and somehow feeling secure, although they were shackled and treated unjustly. I remember that feeling of vulnerability. I remember.
That is a perfect way to think about history and the feelings in our past. And we'd like to offer a few moments for you if you have any questions for Tammy Denease. She would be happy to answer them.
No questions? It's okay, you can ask me. Tammy Denease will be over here and Sarah Margot will be over here. So I'll stand right here in the middle. Yes. How long did it take me to get the linguistics and the dialogue? Let's see. Once I started hanging around my friend that came from Nigeria, I picked it up like that. But it took a while for me to get close to someone, but it was not hard. I did my what's the other one? African ancestry DNA, and I found out I'm from Cameroon, so that made it easier. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I do have a question. I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, but I was reading a couple days ago that my group actually returned back to Connecticut.
Yes.
And went back as a missionary in Sierra Leone.
Yes. If you come to the family day on Sunday, you'll get to hear her whole entire story.
And just one last thing, my DNA goes back to Cameroon also.
Oh, we must talk. Are there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. We just were on the Amistad boat and they were telling the story just like the young lady did here.
Mm-hmm.
And what struck me when you were telling the story is, we were talking about Farmington and they were welcoming and, when people went out on speaking tours to raise money, and then hearing it from your voice and your person, it really opened my eyes what that was really like, even though it was better than being in jail, certainly, maybe. And it was like reality to raise money to go back home, but still, you really, I just was really struck by that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Yes, ma'am.
It's my DNA as well, and I'm Cameroon and Benin. So.
All right then. Okay, we gotta talk. Thank you for that.
Proudest moments
Yes.
for me to find out that I had that connection. So my question to you is, when you do this presentation, you kind of transport the audience back to 1839. Yes. And I'm wondering, kind of, what are your motivations? How did you get started? What motivations do you do?
I'm originally from Columbus, Mississippi, and growing up in Mississippi, as big of a conundrum as that is, it was important. Education was very important, but when we migrated to New England, history was not being taught correctly. And it was a shock to me to learn that the Black community here did not know its heritage, that it didn't go any further than Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman. And that was disturbing to me. And so as I got older, I decided that I wanted to teach, but I wasn't really sure how. I spent 4 years working for Connecticut Historical Society. And actually, I heard about the Amistad through Ms. Debbie Allen's pursuit to try to get the story told. And then when I worked at the Historical Society, I had the pleasure of being a guide and an educator to do the 5-room tour of the Amistad. And that is where I learned more and more. But my roots in Mississippi, I knew my great-grandmother. She was formerly enslaved. She lived to be 125. And my grandmother lived to be 107. So it was very important for me to tell other than the basic stories and to get beyond only 2 Black prominent people. Because in Mississippi, it wasn't Martin for us, it was Medgar Evers. So they were best friends, but it was Medgar Evers. So that was my catalyst to do what I'm doing. Thank you for that question. Thank you. Yes.
Have you personally had a chance to return to Africa?
Have I done what?
Having a chance to return to Africa.
Where's Margot? Margot over here?
No,
Wait.
not Margot.
Oh, Tammy? No, Tammy has not. I was getting ready to take a trip to Ghana just before COVID. And so that trip has been put on hold because I have to do some research for one of my other women, Belinda Royal. And I was planning to sort of like do a little trip for both areas for both women. So I have no idea when I'm going to get to go now, but that was the plan. So hopefully it'll happen soon. Who knows? Thank you. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments? Don't be shy. So y'all all knew about Margot? Y'all all knew beyond the legal case? Yes, sir.
Many males that go around telling these stories.
No, there's not many Black people in this area that's doing what I do. So I'm looking for people. I am looking. I have the Hidden Women Stage Company, and I have been trying for years to get others to do this because I can't do it forever, and the stories need to continue. So unfortunately, there aren't many of us. Kevin Johnson from the Connecticut State Library, he is one that does private web, and he has another gentleman that he's getting ready to do, I think Mr. Thorpe. But there are groups that's actually not in Connecticut, but there are some of us doing it, but not that many around here. So I'm sort of alone. I'm kind of alone. Yes.
I would just like to thank you for the part you're taking in addressing the initiative you mentioned, and that is the way American history is mistaught,
Yes.
and how it's really history by omission.
Yes.
So I really so appreciate it.
Thank you.
What
Thank
you're
you
doing.
so much. Thank you. I wanted to tell her story because everyone was focusing on the legal case, and they were making John Quincy Adams the great white savior and the hope, and he didn't even want that. He didn't even want it, but that's what history does. And so I wanted to speak to the humanity of the captives, and I wanted to speak to their resilience and their determination to be treated as human beings and to get back home. And that was the main catalyst for wanting to tell Margot's story, because until I did the research and was at CHS, I didn't even know there were 4 children either. And the movie doesn't even speak to it, but the movie is Hollywood. But it got the story out there, so I am grateful for that. But they don't even talk about the 4 kids. So it was important to tell their story. And like I said, if you come on Sunday, you'll get a more in-depth story of her life and what happens when she goes back to Africa. I go on at 1:30 in front of the Amistad at Riverfront Recapture. So if you're in the area, please come down and support the program. We would really love to see you. If no one else has any other questions or comments, I will be here. So if you wanted to talk to me afterwards, I will see you at the end. Yes, ma'am.
One thing that I didn't see very really good all the information I posted.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, she was a missionary, but what faith? It didn't speak, was she Catholic, was she Protestant, was she?
Goodness, that went right. Well, okay, who knows the answer to that? The church in Farmington, is it Congregationalist? It is Congregationalist, yes. That she was Congregationalist because of what was happening in Farmington. And they would go back, but you gotta come hear the rest of the story. So you gotta come hear the rest of the story to hear about that adventure and what happened in Farmington. I mean, even though Farmington like to say they were all welcoming, so you got to come hear the story on Sunday. Thank you, everyone, so very much. I appreciate
it. Thank you so much, Tammy. And I do encourage you to go down to the riverfront on Sunday. The Discovering Amistad organization, which runs the schooner and a number of educational programs that teach about the story of the Amistad and social justice. The schooner is down in Hartford. It's the first time it's been here in 20 years. And if you go to Family Day on Sunday, you'll see a lot of great performances and have a chance to learn more about the ship and the story. As Tammy mentioned, the Congregational Church in Farmington was active in housing and working with people who were on the Amistad. And Talcott Street Church in Hartford, as I mentioned before, which is now Faith Congregational Church, was also playing a very important role in that story. They helped raise money, and they helped organize a missionary group. And 2 members of that church actually went back to Africa with Margot and all of her other companions from the Amistad. So this church has played a very important role. And there are so many different aspects of this story. And I think one of the things about the story is it has every emotion in the world attached to it, but it also has the feeling of inspiration attached to it. And I have not known Pastor Cleo Graham from Faith Congregational Church for very long. She's been here since November of last year, and I've only known her for a few short months, but I had the pleasure of spending, like, I invaded her space for 3 hours one afternoon and talked with her and her husband, Melvin Graham, for a very long time about life and about history and about how history informs personal life, community life. It was a wonderful conversation. And so it would be impossible to have a program today without having Pastor Cleo here to share her thoughts and her inspirations with all of you. We feel so honored to have her here today. And I would like to ask you to come up and speak to our group.
Thank you, Sally, for those kind remarks. That was time well spent. Even though I said I only had 15 minutes, it was the best 3 hours that I spent in a long time in between Zoom meetings. I also want to really introduce my husband, who is an African-American genealogist and a great historian that I get a chance to pick his brain often, and that's Melvin Graham. I always say that we met 33 days after I arrived at college, so that was many years ago. We're still very close. I do want to thank Sally and the committee for putting this gathering together. I want to also acknowledge Faith Congregational Church, who is here, and also Wayne and Patricia and the group that just recently sang, Miles. I want to really thank you, Tammy, for your portrayal, because I had a choice of who I might study, Margot or the boy, the 11-year-old boy. So you kind of closed a gap for me. And thank you also for being related somewhat to my husband, who he found out was connected with Cameroon as well, and also Paula as well. So thank you very much. So I get to give a reflection, and I'm so used to preaching these days that I had to kind of sit tight a bit and not be preachy. I'm also very interested in the history as well. The Amistad Africans in America is a historic and an inspiring story that kind of captures our faith, our hope, our love, our trust, our courage, and our resilience, and so much more. I love visiting these types of stories because it really inspires me. Just imagine being a slave and then wanting to be free and becoming free, how that must feel. It is a journey from slavery to freedom that builds our sense of community, because it's something that we cannot do alone. It builds our sense of human rights and justice. It builds our courage. It builds our resilience. And it challenges us to respond to this great gospel of Matthew, who says, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy mind, our soul, and love your neighbor as yourselves." Who is our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? We're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, but who are we? And who are our neighbors? And how close or how far is our neighbor today? This Amistad story tells us that our neighbor is beyond these walls. It's beyond even our zip codes. It's far, it's several communities wide. And several communities can be instrumental in fighting injustices. We have shown that we have done it during the 1800s. What about now? Do we still have the stuff to do it even today? Do we? I don't hear anyone saying yes. Yes, yes. So it's a compelling story about trust and faith. It's compelling, and it's a fight. And so we think back to what it must have been like. Faith Congregational Church, let me tell you a little bit about Faith, because it's the type of church that makes me want to wake up in the morning in Rhode Island, where I live, and drive for 2 hours to come to spend time with this church, because it breeds history. It breeds history. It breeds involvement. Faith Congregational Church in 2019 celebrated its 200th anniversary. And it has its roots in the African Religious Society, which began in 1819. And then it transitioned to the Talcott Street Church. You will notice that churches change their names, but they don't change the people. They don't change the people. And so what was happening in 1826, though, was it was a time when African Americans couldn't really, say, worship together with people of other colors. In fact, you would find in Hartford that some of the folks had to worship behind walls, behind galleries, to be not even heard or seen. And we know that such a place existed back then. They call it Center Church today, and it's certainly not like that today. But this is what groups had to face during that time. And so, but in 1820, this congregation moved to a building in State Street and formed the first Black Congregational Church in Connecticut and the third and oldest in the country. The church initially called itself, again, the African Religious Society of Hartford, but made a commitment to design a place where any and everyone could come and worship together. And then finally, it grew so large that in 1826, it built a stone and brick church on the corner of Talcott and Market Street. And the reason why I emphasize the stone and brick, because we have one of those bricks or stones impregnated in our current church at a Faith Congregational Church. And I'm so glad about that, because again, as I mentioned last week, that when I came first to Hartford looking for Talcott Church, I couldn't find the remnants of it. I couldn't find a flag, I couldn't find a plaque, nothing. But what I did find was the stories, the soul, and that's most important. I found the souls of the people. And so they built this Talcott Street church, very, very active church in the community. And now we're Faith Congregational Church, but again, the soul is still there. So the Amistad story, as we remember, began in 1839. We had slave hunters who abducted Africans, and then several days into the journey, they end up the coast of Connecticut. And I won't go into detail about that because you've heard that story. But let me tell you about the pastor of Talcott Street Church during that time. His name was Reverend James C.W. Pennington. And he was the head, but at the same time, he was a slave himself. He had escaped from Maryland, still a slave, but was bent on helping these other slaves, was willing to risk his life to help them. And so the other interesting thing about Reverend Pennington and Faith Congregational Church today, if you were to enter our church, you would see a plaque. And that plaque was left by the previous owners. The previous pastor there happened to be related to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, her brother-in-law purchased James Pennington so that he could have his freedom. See the connections, aren't they interesting? He purchased him so that he could eventually have his freedom, and he did. Reverend Pennington did gain his freedom. But that's a story for another day, and those discussions are coming up. But I just want you to know about the connections. Anyways, by the 1830s, there was a rise of abolitionist movements in this area. And we had many abolitionists that showed up and they spoke. We had Henry Highland Garnet, we had Arnold Buckman. We had so many here throughout New England. And then there was this anti-slavery society as well. So people were really revved up and ready to help where they could, but they needed someone to galvanize people together. And that's where Reverend Pennington comes in. He organized supportive groups throughout the neighborhood and gathered them together and aggressively raised funds to help those who were in prison. He had people attend the trials daily. He had many ways of telling the story and helping the people that were incarcerated. By 1841, we find that all this ended up to be such a reward for not only the church, but for the people, because they were eventually set free. And Reverend Pennington gives sort of this opening prayer to thousands of people that showed up to hear the story about what they call Mendian people. And it was during this farewell gathering that Sinbei and Sinke, they called him, testified. He said, "If it had not been for the Lord on my side, where would I be?" And so we understand that many of them, I don't want to say converted to Catholicism, but they learned about the God that the Talcott Street and the other churches celebrated. They learned about the Christ. They learned that we are one people. And we became a community with them as well. And so he said he was thankful for the committee for befriending him. And he spoke about his love for Christ. And he spoke about so many gifts that he received. And so I want you to think about what it means to be in relationship with one another. That's a gift. Even people that are different from us. We receive many gifts, and there's a magnitude of captives even today. And have you made a relationship with one of them? You know, we learn to love and we learn to have compassion through practice. Otherwise, we would never understand what it means to be a comforter. And so giving the gifts of faith, hope, and love is often the kind of support that most people need. Freedom doesn't mean that you're bound physically. Sometimes people are bound even emotionally or spiritually. But they depend upon our love and our comfort. Giving the gifts of love, hope, and faith is a source of power. Power for the giver and the power for the receiver as well. The book of Acts reminds us that God sends a comforter for us, this invisible spirit that comes to us, sometimes through people, but comes to us and helps us during these very tough and disturbing times. But we receive this power to overcome whatever bondage that we're in. And so we remember these words that blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the meek, so they shall inherit the earth. And it reminds me of the story of Cale. He's the 11-year-old boy who barely spoke English, but he took these few words together and he wrote a letter to the former president, John Quincy Adams, who was officiating their trial. And he said, "We want to ask the court what we have done wrong. All we want is to make us free." And it was so profound that an 11-year-old boy would do something like that. And he got an answer. He got a long answer from John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams heard him. And I really believe that that was also a turning point for the whole trial. Because John Quincy Adams sent a farewell letter to the Mendians and the prospect of them returning to their native land. The gift of hope. The gift of hope was given to them. And so that helps you to fight on. And so what happened? How did Talcott Street Church fare after After the trial was over and there was a successful judgment, it didn't end there. We had members. We had, they say, two members named Henry Wilson, who was a tailor, who was born enslaved in Barbados but lived as a free man in Hartford, and his wife, Tamara Clark Wilson. They went on the boat with them, and they became a part of the group. But not only that, they went as missionaries to build relationships again between America and the Mende people. There was also Reverend and Mrs. William Raymond and Reverend James Steele. So there were 5 of them that accompanied 35 of the remaining Amistad Africans to Sierra Leone as missionaries. And so that's what it means to build community and to build up one another. It just doesn't end. And so in closing, because so much was said, I want you to think in terms of the Sankofa bird. Sankofa bird that looks back and gathers all that we need today, but always steps forward. The past certainly informs us. And we today, when I look upon this audience today, I say it's probably very, very different from what it was in the 1800s. But we're community. You showed up here because there's an interest. We're community. And so I say to love one another as you would love yourself. Think in terms of that. Most times when people act up, it's because they don't have enough love. So love one another, comfort one another, be in community with one another, so that history does not repeat itself. Amen. Amen.
Thank you so much, Pastor Cleo. I love your talk of community and building relationships, because this case, this story would not have gone anywhere had people not formed relationships on La Amistad that enabled them to fight for their freedom. If they hadn't formed relationships when they got to New London, to Hartford, to New Haven. That is such an important part of this story and every story, and I think it's an important idea to keep close to our hearts as we work to carry the Amistad story forward in our own lives. We're going to end our program today with more music. And I am going to say a couple of things before that, because I don't want the last thing that you hear tonight to be my voice. I want the last thing you hear tonight to be the music. I do want to remind you again to go down to the schooner, to come back here to visit, to stay with us after this program. We have some light refreshments. You can see the Senate upstairs where the part of the trial was, and you can enjoy the old State House. You'll also see around this room some of these bookmarks, and on the back are QR codes that will bring you to programs that we have done about the Amistad over the last many years, video programs, and you will also find articles related to the Amistad story that you might find interesting and helpful. And I also would like to thank everybody who has made today possible. Rebecca Tabor is the head of public programs here. She did a lot to organize this tonight. Mariana did a wonderful presentation tonight. She put a lot of work into that. And the rest of our staff is here, and I hope you will meet them as you visit the rest of the building tonight. But now I would like to introduce again Miles Wilson Tolliver, who is accompanied by James Berry. He is going to perform for us, and I think that will be a wonderful way to end this story. We've talked a little bit today about Sengbe Pia, also known as Sinke, who was a master communicator who could make people understand what he was saying even when he didn't speak the language. And I also want to remind everybody that these were very young men who came here on the Amistad. There were 4 children. Most of these men were 30 or younger. They were young men who raised their voices, who made a difference. And one thing I love about the Voices of Hartford, even though I'm just getting to know them, I feel like they're in this same vein of helping people to raise their voices, and that is just so important. So I would like to welcome back Miles Wilson Tolliver and James Berry and the Voices of Hartford.
Hello, everyone. We are Voices of Hartford. We want to thank you so much for having us tonight. As it was stated prior, we do lift our voices to sing, and actually, we are all, I'm assuming we're all young, as we're all young men as well, so Tom, you're young as well. But thank you so much for having us.
Good evening, or good afternoon. The God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. Ironically, these are the words of the founding father, Thomas Jefferson, who happened to be a slave owner. But there's another irony. I believe that the Mendes on the ship Amistad would have agreed with him. The God who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time. Isn't that ironic? I love it. And so we've decided to sing those words in a setting by Randolph Thompson, who is one of America's foremost choral composers. And it is the first of the four movements of a piece called Testament of Freedom. So.
Liberty.
Young men. The next piece we're going to do is an African American spiritual called Steal Away. And in it is also, you will hear the quest for freedom. Steal Away is one of the earliest spirituals. And it was originally created because the slaves wanted to find a place where they could safely worship God. Thank you. And so they had to hide. They were not allowed to gather in groups. So they had to hide in the woods or anywhere where they could not be detected. And once the place was designated where they would meet, they had to have a signal for each other to know when the meeting was going to take place. And I just could imagine that when it was time, one of the slaves would come, walk through the plantation, singing the words, steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. I ain't got long to stay here. It was a signal song to steal away. And then later on, we all know about the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman used it a lot in her organization to, again, send a signal that it was time for whoever was going to leave with her to gather, and so that they can safely depart. So, again, steal away. And I just really like that word, steal away. I mean, the idea that we're going to steal our own bodies away, is just really incredible to me. So let's hear it. Steal away. Oh, yeah. I forgot I'm singing.
Wayne is going to be very modest, but he is the arranger for this piece that we're about to sing. Green trees are bending, for sadness stands a-trembling, the trumpet song, within our